Hi. Earlier this month was July 8th. That was the day 281 years ago Jonathan Edwards preached sinners in the hands of an angry God, one of the greatest messages in Christendom history. And some attribute it to sparking the first Great Awakening, but actually it's inaccurate. The first Great Awakening was already on the way with John Wesley and Whitefield and a few other men. And Jonathan Edwards was in direct resistance of it because of the signs and wonders and the things that were being reported. He thought that surely was from the devil. He formed this message and he first preached it to his own church, his own congregation, and it fell upon deaf ears. They were resistant because they were hard-necked, stiff-necked people. And he preached it at Enfield, and it truly awoken all of them, including Jonathan Edwards, to the reality that this first Great Awakening was the movement of God, and now God had put an anointing on him to be part of it. Something else you might not know. 8 years before Jonathan Edwards died, that same congregation that was stiff-necked and resistant fired him. Stay tuned. Jonathan Edwards is another fascinating character. Before I tell you all about him, I want to say thank you again for the likes and the comments and for any of you that have subscribed. Jonathan Edwards was born in 1703, as I mentioned earlier in another episode, at the same time as John Wesley for the same purpose. You know, in the 1700s, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God was preached in 1741, but it was first preached to his own congregation, who he had had for about 10 years prior to that. And he also studied in the academia. He was well respected as a theologian and as a teacher. He was incredibly intelligent, and he set a great pace. I think more so than even Wesley and Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards certainly had a greater study behind him, the mind to study in even the greatest capacity. And that worked a little bit against him for a little while anyway. There was a revival in 1730 that broke out, and George Whitefield was actually leading the way. John Wesley was a bit resistant. He came along and began to outdoor preach, and there was a great need, and the corruption in the church was so fantastic that it had to be addressed. And John Wesley and George Whitefield were God's men to reset the course of Christendom and the Christian church. Jonathan Edwards was also one of those guys, but quite resistant to the revival that was coming. And one of the reasons he was resistant is because, of the day, a lot of reformers were actually not too happy about the signs and wonders that were coming out of these movements. People were fainting and falling on their faces and crying out before God. Some were frozen in time and space in their minds, having a vision of the Most High. There were certainly miraculous healings, and John Wesley would witness many, many healings, and George Whitefield would also witness, and he was even a skeptic to a lot of these things himself, but he couldn't deny the realities of these miraculous signs and wonders. Jonathan Edwards was living in a place in Massachusetts where there seemed to be a whole lot of resistance to this revival, and it was like it was on fire all around them. But Connecticut, Massachusetts, they were known for their resisting of whatever it was that was going on. In fact, Jonathan Edwards was asked to approach the college, who some were experiencing these revivals, some were witnessing miraculous events. And Jonathan Edwards, after he spoke Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, actually had to address the colleges in Princeton because there was a frenzy happening, and he very delicately and precisely put it. He said, can you write off the fact that God is in this, because all that were available to the apostles in the early church are again taking place? Can you write it off because of that? Because your mind can't comprehend it? And he basically said, let's see. And anyway, going back, I don't want to get too far off the track, but when he preached Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God in 1741, he had earlier preached it to his church. It fell on deaf ears because they were a stiff-necked people. And he actually wasn't even the designated preacher that was supposed to preach at Enfield in Connecticut. Yeah, I think there was a cancellation. As far as history goes, this is what I understand. There was a cancellation, and they were like, oh no, better bring in the pinch batter. Oh boy, Edwards, we got to bring him in. But they didn't know him because I'm thinking that the preacher that they probably had was probably a lot more, charismatic and exciting. Edwards was known for being a very mellow-toned man. He never raised his voice or was, as far as I know, was very charismatic, but he just spoke the truth in the Spirit of God. He was a man of prayer, a massive prayer engine, and he spoke the truth. And his studies were so incredibly infallible that by the time you had listened to him, pastors and sinners and saints alike would say you were utterly convinced. This man was not leaving anything out. Every dot and tittle was there. And he preached this, and he being resistant, they say he was even resistant to that revival. His whole attitude was, I'm going to correct this with this message. And his attitude, even toward the very final minutes of him addressing the people, he was resistant to whatever John Wesley and Whitefield was doing. And remember, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield became the best of friends. In fact, George Whitefield was a friend of John Wesley and Jonathan Edwards. He was that middleman. It was a really neat relationship, that symbiotic relationship, and I'm sure in heaven they're all rejoicing. But when Jonathan Edwards gave the address, the Spirit of God fell upon him and the entire place. The only way that it could be described is that every atom in the air was supernaturally charged with the power of Christ. And these people were falling, they were fainting, they were falling on their faces, they were begging God, they were crying out, they were grasping so that they would almost break their fingers onto things. They were so in the fear of the Lord, they were so overwhelmed by the fear of the Lord. And I can't remember how many people came to Christ, but it was certainly the jet engine of the revival that was happening. Jonathan Edwards was convinced now that this is truly the move of God, became a great advocate for the movement. And like I said, he became friends with George Whitefield, the best of friends, and preached at his church. In fact, Jonathan Edwards' wife loved when George Whitefield would come preaching. Oh, she said he was just just an amazing, missing testimony in the church, and they both loved him to pieces. Jonathan Edwards could have probably sat back and relaxed. He wrote a lot of books, but just on that event itself put him in church history as one of the greatest evangelists in all of Christendom. And you would think that old Edwards could ride the gravy train till the rest of his life, but he did not. He could not. In that day that he lived, there was a distinguishing mark between the old lights and the new lights. And the old lights were those who were resistant to revival, probably a lot of them to the end of their days. And unfortunately for them, they just couldn't grasp what God was doing. But the new lights, the ones that had accepted the new wineskins and the purging of the corruption that was in the church, they were the ones who were really leading the charge in these revivals. But as I said, in 1741, when that message was preached by Jonathan Edwards, within 9 years, 8 or 9 years, the old lights started once again influencing into the church these corrupt methods. And one of the things that they had done was they developed the half covenant, and they did this for money. You see, there wasn't enough people in the congregation to, after 9 years later, that they wanted more people, because more people meant more money and bigger wages and blah blah blah. But the half covenant, basically, if you were on the fence of Christianity, if you were like, yeah, I believe, but I don't know if I want to be baptized. If you were there, you could enter into with the church what was called a half covenant, and that allowed you to take communion. Well, obviously, a man of God, the stature of Jonathan Edwards, vehemently opposed it and rebuked them all. And there was a small altercation where he rebuked some boys for saying terrible things about a girl, and that was enough to cause the clergy to gather together an assault against Jonathan Edwards, and 90% of the church voted him out, and by 1750, he had no job. However, he was in very high demand, and his qualifications at the colleges obviously were respected and appreciated, and people flocked to hear him preach. And revivals broke out wherever he was. And I'm going to tell you stories in the future about how the Spirit of Christ so supported this man that when he would walk into a community, they would be laid waste, prepared for the Word of God to enter in. That's not even the saddest part. 8 years later, after Jonathan Edwards lost his job because of corruption, he made a decision that would cost him his life. The college students, and there were a whole bunch of people, and Jonathan Edwards was a major leader figure, and a lot of people looked up to him, and a lot of people were scared of the vaccine, as I'm sure we are today. And I don't know, what this will do, but actually Jonathan Edwards helped. It was his death that sparked a better vaccine and a better way of producing vaccines, believe it or not. Jonathan Edwards said, you know what? Let me take the trials. Let me take the smallpox vaccine. And sure enough, he had a bad batch. He died. It killed him. And so what it did with the scientific community, it sent them into a tither. And they became desperate to change their methods and ways and be more careful. So if we have any, some of the vaccines we've had in the last 100 years, 200 years, I think we predominantly owe a great deal of thanks to him in that. Anyway, there's lots to research, and Jonathan Edwards, there's a lot to unpack, and I'd love to unpack more, but I think I've given you enough to chew on. Thanks for listening. See ya.